Yes, these are the illustrations for Volume 2 of Among the Multihulls, starting with Chapter 12 in Volume 2, 15 minutes. At the conclusion of Volume 1, Chapter 11, we were coming up the Western Caribbean from Guatemala, headed back for the United States. And after 3 years of traveling in the boat, we were sort of ready to come out of it, as you can see. The boys would sometimes hide behind the sails to blow off steam, thinking that we couldn't see them. And here's what we called shark trolling, with Russell riding in the hammock, dragging his fanny in the ocean. Of course, the boys had grown up around the boats. My clients' boats. This was taken even before we started to build Scrimshaw, so they knew what they were in for. But by the time we got to Virginia, we were all ready to get off of the boat, no doubt. That's Stephen on the left, sometime in the 1960s. And here he is about the time we arrived in Virginia in 1975. Yep, there's Russell. The boys were really growing up, and Joanna and I were talking about how we'd love to have a dog and a cat and a piano. Here's Joanna at about that time. She was destined to become very much involved in gardening, and I was absolutely flummoxed. I had no idea what I was going to do with my life next. I think all of us really suffered to some extent from reverse culture shock. I've tried to talk about it in the book. We really felt like strangers in our own homeland for a while. Still do in a way. And we were like the boll weevil looking for a home. And this is what we found. Yep, this is the chicken house. It had been one of those small post-war egg-laying operations. It just happened that the farmer had located it on one of the nicest home sites around. It sticks out on a point here in one of those little tidewater drowned rivers that I've talked about in the book. It was just a big tin shed. But it had this beautiful oak tree on the point out in front of it, sticking almost out over the river. The spread on its branches was 85 feet. We learned to really love this tree. And we used the shed as a boat shop for about 4 years while we lived in a little rented house next door, but we finally got tired of paying rent, so we were able to buy the property on which the chicken house was standing and started to fix it up. We put an apartment, a little apartment in one end. It was supposed to be temporary. We really were going to tear the shed down and build ourselves a sure enough house. But as time went on, we started fixing it up more and more and got to kind of like it, particularly its location out there with that tree. And we also had all of these textiles that we had collected in Guatemala. We needed a place to put them up. So here we are, 36 years later, still living in the chicken house. It's changed a lot inside and out. You wouldn't really recognize it today as an old tin shed unless you looked closely. But this is our place, Brown's Boat Hatchery, Hick Neck, Virginia. And of course, our textiles. We've got too much stuff hanging up in this place. Not long after we arrived in Virginia, here in 1976, was the first World Multihull Symposium, a really historic event. And I'm not sure you can see the faces, but I want to register the names of these multihull pioneers. Front row, bottom left, on the left, moving left to right, here is Tom Rowland, Hugo Myers, then Lot Crowther, Rod McAlpin Downey, Ed Horseman, and myself seated on the right. Then in the back row, Rudy Choi, Norman Cross, Dick Newick, James Wareham, Andrew Simpson, Bob Harris, Derek Kelsall, and that was the panelists for the first World Multi-Hull Symposium, Toronto, 1976. Only two of the true trailblazers were not there. That was Woody Brown and Arthur Piver. Otherwise, this was a seminal event in the history of the modern multi-hull. Many of us designers had never met each other, but it was particularly important for me because I got to meet Dick Newick. Dick and I had corresponded for years, but we had never met. Here he is at the helm of Rogue Wave out in the ocean. And it was through Dick that I had a chance to meet probably his most illustrious client and perhaps the most revered of all the American multi-hull sailors, even today. This is Phil Weld, climbing out of the cockpit of his 50-foot Newick-designed trimaran Moxie, in which he won the single-handed transatlantic race in 1980 at age 65, sailing against 25 younger men. But I'm getting a little ahead of the story here. This is Phil Weld's Gulf Streamer, a 60-foot racing trimaran, also designed by Dick Newick, 2 boats before the Moxie. Note the veil of spray peeling up from the lee float bow in the foreground here. Now this is the same boat, same picture, and note the wake. Gulfstreamer was one of the first truly big and powerful ocean racing trimarans of the 1970s. It really paved the way for what was to come. But very sadly, Phil lost this boat in a mid-Atlantic capsize. He was rescued, and I had something to do with capsize preparation. This is Phil on the day we spoke together aboard Gulfstreamer, shortly before he set off across the Atlantic on his ill-fated voyage. And I was able to tell him of another capsize and how the returning crew had managed to sustain themselves for a long time. I gave that information to Phil. He made adequate preparations, and he and his crew survived in the capsized Gulfstreamer for about 4 days without undue hardship. And with his typically buoyant attitude, he went right around and replaced Gulfstreamer with Rogue Wave. Now, she was also a 60-foot racing trimaran designed by Dick Newick and built by the Goujon brothers in Michigan of their then relatively new wood epoxy laminating technique. I still think of Rogue Wave as one of the most beautiful sailing vessels I've ever seen. And I had a chance to spend some time with her, as it is told in the book. The amazing thing about her is that when she really got going, man, she would cut the tops right off of the waves with her cross beams. Here she is decapitating a big one. Make no mistake, it was Dick Newick who taught the world how to go so very fast in such very rough water. To my mind, the most profoundly influential designer of modern times. Now, coming east, I also had a chance to meet Chris White. Starting at age 18, Chris had built one of my Sea Runner trimarans and sailed it off to South America, and then sailed back to the chicken house and said, okay, what's next? And because of our friendship with Dick Newick and Phil Weld, I was just starting in on our first sailing trimaran workboat project. The name of the boat was Sib, S-I-B, for Small is Beautiful. And this is Sib, and that was Chris at the helm of Sib. This was a very pivotal project for us, our first constant camber construction boat. We'll hear a lot more about constant camber in the chapters that come, but this boat was built at Brown's Boat Hatchery in Virginia, and trucked up to Maine and put together up there where we launched her over a cliff and sailed her back to Virginia. Now, Sib was a very interesting boat. Notice that she has a split rig, 2 masts, both unstayed, and the forward mast has a sail called the Lundstrom sail. There's actually 2 panels of sail there, so that when sailing downwind, the 2 panels could be opened up to double the sail area on the foremast for sailing downwind, particularly in light air. Now, Dick and I designed the boat together. It was our notion of a sailing workboat for third world watermen. And by an obscure quirk of fate, this boat led to much of what happens in the rest of the book. But before we go there, we've got to get back to the chicken house. This is the original Jezero, spelled J-Z-E-R-O, designed and built by Russell Brown. It's his adaptation of the ancient Micronesian canoe, 30 feet long. I'll have a lot more to say about proas in succeeding chapters, but this is where I began to learn about the pure windward proa. Here she is reefed down on a very windy day. Notice that it looks like she has a bow on both ends, and she does. And indeed, she goes either end first. This is something that I'll try to explain in detail a little later. Here she is with friends aboard as Russell was preparing to depart for Point South. This is the departure itself. I like the photo because of its autonomy. Russell leaving home at age 16 in a boat of his own creation. Two years later, down in the Caribbean, his mother and I have not heard a whole lot about the trip. One story I have heard is that one night when Russell and his friend were sleeping under that little tent on the platform, the float decided to sink and they woke up sliding off into the water. Now, I don't mean to make light of this because it wasn't easy for any of us to have our boys leave home in their teens. But it was clear that they were going to leave anyway, and they wanted to leave in boats, and so we figured we'd get behind their projects and help them. Maybe better than leaving in cars. Now, this is a model of Stephen's escape vehicle. It was inspired by the cartoon strip, The Ballad of Zachary Bone. This is Stephen's idea of Zachary Bone's boat in which he sailed off into the wild blue yonder to meet up with his violet bush out in the Pacific. Stephen named his Moxa and built it in the chicken house, as did Russell. And it looked like this before it was launched. A lot of bottom on it in order to tolerate the load that he was going to have to carry in order to live on board. It was only 21 feet long, just an open cuddy cabin. Under sail in the Chesapeake before loading up for taking off. And a year or two later down in the Florida Keys with his friend, and I haven't heard any stories about it sinking under them. Well, that's the way it happened. I'm not saying it was right or wrong or good or bad, but both of our sons went sailing off into manhood in their teens. And that left their folks sort of staring at each other, asking, is that all there is to the circus? And to begin to answer that, we'll have to go on to chapter 13. Bye-bye.